Sup boys? So it's about time that we actually go over Eula and all she has to offer, kind of how to build her. I'm going to be trying something a little bit different with this video, a little bit of a different format of how I gather all the information and present it to you. So hopefully this can kind of be the new norm from here on out. This is going to be slightly controversial depending on like refinement levels and stacks and stuff like that, as always, but essentially if you are going by raw data, Wolf's Gravestone actually does pull out as the #1 damage dealing weapon for her, although the stacks and keeping up the passive and stuff like that is going to be extremely difficult to maintain to keep that. So I guess in a sense, Wolf's Gravestone is kind of like the end-all be-all highest number that you could hit, but realistically, Song of Broken Pines makes way more sense, and it's a lot easier to keep the passives up, and I think over time it's just going to be way more consistent than Wolf's Gravestone altogether. The Unforged is also really freaking good here, especially we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of team compositions later. The team with Zhongli, the Unforged does amazing on it. It's absolutely great. Skyward Pride is in kind of a weird spot because it does have energy recharge on it. It's not going to give us as good of a situation as some of the other weapon choices here, but it actually does alleviate some problems that Eula may face, and it kind of frees up some issues with her team compositions as well. The Serpent Spine also does really freaking amazing here. It typically does amazing on every DPS focused character. Crit rate as a passive is amazing, and the actual effect on the weapon is great here as well. But now all of those weapons so far are pretty unfree-to-play friendly. Serpent Spine completely unfree-to-play, and the other ones are just going to be maybe you got it, maybe you don't. Some more free-to-play options, you definitely would want to focus on Prototype Archaic or Snow Tomb Star Silver. If you are in a situation where you have both and you are literally looking at two of the exact same refinements, maybe you kind of want to decide on which one you're going to be using on another character, because they're extremely close, with Archaic barely pulling it out ahead. So they are extremely close, and it's negligible the difference that you're going to see over long periods of time. Yeah, maybe you'll see a ton of difference, but overall they're pretty similar. And then Skyrider Greatsword is actually really good here with his physical damage on his secondary stat, works out really well. And Debate Club is kind of the default option if you are working on another weapon or just, you know, basically waiting to get to another weapon. That's where you would kind of want to fall as the default option. Then we also have Lithic Blade and Black Cliff Slasher. Now, Lithic Blade with a leeway character on your team actually can push Eula above Prototype Archaic and Snow Tombed, but you do actually have to dedicate a slot on your team to a leeway character, and if your team doesn't kind of fit that mold, then Lithic Blade probably shouldn't even be used here. Prototype Archaic or Snow Tombed would definitely be better. And then Black Cliff Slasher is kind of in a weird spot. I like it for the fact that it has crit damage on it. It works out really nice, although it could be kind of overkill on the crit damage if you are trying to stay true to that golden 1-to-2 ratio. And also I hate the fact that it has an effect of after defeating an opponent, because those effects are kind of super crappy in general. But once you get rolling with it, it could actually do some pretty good damage. A 4-piece Pale Flame is your ultimate goal if you can get good substats. It in general does by far the best in terms of all of her calculations and all of the numbers that you can run on her. It ends up doing the absolute best out of all of the sets. But with 4 pieces kind of being difficult to get good substats on, you may run into an issue where you want to just do 2 pieces of one set and 2 pieces of another. If it comes to that, I would highly recommend that you do 2 pieces of Pale Flame and then either 2 pieces of Bloodstained or 2 pieces of Gladiator, depending on this one factor. If your weapon has attack percent on it, out of the ones we just talked about, this would be like Wolf's Gravestone, Unforged, Lithic, Archaic, and Debate Club all have attack percent as their secondary stat. If you're running a weapon with those, you don't want to go with Gladiator, you would want to go with Bloodstained. And the reason for that is if you overload any single stat in this game, you end up just seeing diminishing returns over time, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to invest heavily on one single stat. You kind of want to spread the stats out as best you can. So overloading your attack percent is worse, and you should probably focus on just giving Eula that physical percent, or vice versa, depending on which situation you're in. Now, if you don't go with those 3 combinations, you could end up going with something like a 4-piece of Gladiator. That actually works out pretty well, especially since Gladiator has the added bonus of the Claymore, you know, getting extra normal attack and stuff. Noblesse works out pretty good here as well. If you don't already have a Noblesse user and for whatever reason you want to run that on your Eula, she could be a pretty decent candidate for it, as her burst is pretty gnarly in terms of damage. And ultimately, if you run into a situation where you don't have 4 good Noblesse pieces, you can still end up doing Pale Flame and Noblesse as 2 pieces of each. Now, when it comes to the stats that we're going to be talking about here, on your timepiece, on your actual sands, you typically would want to run attack percent. On your goblet, you would always want to run physical damage. You don't want to stray too far away from physical damage. There's some cases to be made for a cryo version of Eula, but it underperforms heavily compared to the physical damage version. So physical percent is kind of like the king here, and crit rate or crit damage on your circlet, depending on what gets you closer to that 1-to-2 ratio. Now, some people out there may be thinking, oh, well, you know, energy recharge is going to be pretty big on her because her burst does cost 80 energy to fire. While that is true, energy recharge is super important. If you dedicate an entire timepiece to it, you are going to overkill on your energy recharge, and you're going to be wasting potential attack percent that would be way more valuable on her than that energy recharge. Typically, you'd want to get that energy recharge out of your substats, which is a good segue because substats here, energy recharge is pretty freaking good as always, especially with DPSs. Crit rate, crit damage makes tons of sense as your substats, and then you can kind of work into other things that you may see fit. Ultimately, the case with energy recharge is that if you already have a decent battery in your team composition, which we will talk about later, things like Diana or Rosaria or even Kaya are decent batteries, and they do well enough that you don't need to dedicate an entire piece to energy recharge. You are ultimately looking for about 130% energy recharge with a good battery. If you don't have a good battery, then obviously it may make some more sense to go into a energy recharge piece, but that is highly situational. And since everyone comes with a Kaya on their account, you already have a good battery, so it kind of nullifies that argument to an extent. Maybe you just don't have Kaya built, understandable. Ultimately, Kaya is just going to be more beneficial overall to your team and overall damage rather than copping out and going with an energy recharge timepiece. You typically would want to have your Q be the highest one that you have if you had to choose between that and your normal attack. Typically, I would maybe choose my Q 51% of the time if I had to choose between the materials, although you can kind of keep them both at the same level. But if you are going to have to level one up first, use your Q and then you can go into your normal attack. Your elemental skill or your E is basically in this weird spot where you don't really have to get it super high. Its damage is helpful but negligible in the overall scheme of things, and you can typically just get it to level 6 and scrap it from there. Essentially, we've gone through our weapon, we've gone through our artifacts, and we've gone through our talents. Your Eula, based on your decisions, should be at a position to start dealing good damage. How do you actually deal that damage? Well, typically there are what we would like to refer to as rotations for characters. These rotations deal with what kind of specific order you would do your normal attack, your elemental skill, and your elemental burst in to maximize a damage per rotation. For example, we're going to use a little bit of a different notation here, which I will try to keep in mind that this is not very widely known. I may just even put this notation down here like as a little cheat sheet because it's kind of hard to keep up with if you don't already know this kind of stuff. So basically we have our normal attack, which is going to be denoted by an N. We have our elemental skill, which is denoted by an E, and we have our elemental burst, which is denoted by a Q. Now, some of these are going to have numbers after them, typically the normal attack, and that just means how many times you're going to perform that specific action before you go on to the next step. So for instance, we may have a situation where we go N4. That just means we do our normal attack 4 times. So for Eula, the typical, like probably the easiest way to maximize your damage to begin with is going to be with this simple rotation. E, then Q, then N4, then hold E, and then N4 again.
I condemn you.
What that essentially does is it ends up yielding you 13 to 14 stacks on your Lightfell sword for your Q right before it ends up popping. Now, the reason I say 13 to 14 is because it is going to slightly depend on how you do your timings here. With your Ascension level 1, if you end up going a little bit too quickly, the frame where your Ascension 1 talent, which is the Wellspring of Warlust, which just gives you an extra stack and resets your elemental skill, if that talent and your normal attack end up hitting on the same frame, it only only ends up giving you 1 stack overall. So it's either a stack from your Ascension 1 talent or it's a stack from your normal attack. And essentially the only way to get around that is to literally just kind of wait a couple of frames after that A1 should kick in. Then you can kind of go back into your N4 just like you normally would. If you don't wait, it ends up giving you 13 stacks. And if you do wait, it gives you 14, ultimately granting you just a tad bit more damage from that Lightfell sword whenever it, comes out ultimately. The nice thing about this rotation is it also does keep a couple of stacks on Eula throughout the duration of the combo, which ends up granting her a little bit of extra defense and some stagger resistance, which is kind of cool. Typically, if you're running a team that has some energy hungry characters on it, we're going to talk about a team with Beto a little bit later. There is a rotation that you can do to generate more energy, and there's actually kind of 2 of them, but they're pretty simple. They start off with E as well, then we go into Q, and then we do another E, then we do N4, then we dash. Basically, after N4, there's gonna be that big lull period where she's just kind of like standing there waiting on you to do something, and then you're like spamming buttons, and you're like, please go. So we dash to get rid of that. Then we do an N2, and then hold E, and then N1. It'll actually get you another tap E worth of energy particles back on Eula, which is actually really good.
Vengeance will be mine. Rack and ruin. More speed.
Now, a lot less complicated version of that is to just do E, Q, hold E, and then N4 dash N4.
Freeze to the core. I condemn you.
That's probably the one that I would go with just because it's easier to remember, but ultimately you can do either one you like. And remember, ultimately it's about the same DPS, but it is slightly less. Typically, the first and foremost easiest team is probably going to end up being a triple cryo team. And I know that sounds super overkill, but the amount of energy that Eula needs, especially like I was talking about earlier, if you only hit that 130% mark of her energy recharge, you are going to need a lot of energy to keep that 80 burst energy going. In the second slot, you can either have Rosaria or Kaya. Depending on which one you feel more comfortable with, definitely go with that one. But if you do actually have Rosaria at C2 and you can give her a Favonius Lance, then she actually does really, really well and slightly outpaces Kaya. Her Q is just a lot easier to work around a lot of times, and depending on how you feel about that, that may be the deciding factor, and you may go with Kaya anyways. But either Kaya or Rosaria, depending on how you feel about them, choose one. And then we would want to go with Diona, however you want to pronounce it, because if you give Diona a sacrificial bow or a Favonius war bow, both of those will generate tons of energy with her, and she is one of the best batteries in the game, and she doubles as a healer, so she's pretty freaking amazing. And then for your final slot, typically, and you will kind of see this a lot today, Fischl is one of like the best 4th slots for her. You can run another Electro if you'd like to. Lisa is also a valid option, although the differences between Lisa and Fischl are pretty easy to understand if you just compare the 2 of them on paper. Outside of that, Razor wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. He's a pretty selfish carry in general, and you're using Fischl ultimately to generate particles off field, and she is a great contender to proc Superconduct, which lowers physical resistance and ultimately helping Eula just do more damage. Now, the best thing about this team is that it's pretty low in terms of investment to get decent reward from it. So Eula being your main DPS, maybe you want to have her as like the highest level on your team. Rosaria having C2 is kind of bad in terms of like how much you would need to invest for that, but Kaya is free and you don't need to have very many constellations on him at all. I literally just got C1 of Kaya, and that is pitiful. Anyways, Kaya is amazing if you don't have Rosaria at C2, so the investment to get Kaya to a usable level is pretty low in itself. Diona can be kind of cost effective, but typically it's the fact that her E has so many hits that allows Favonius Warbow to proc, and if you have Sacrificial Bow, it just having Sacrificial Bow at higher refinements is going to be a little bit better than Favonius Warbow, but typically it's the fact that her E has multiple hits, which allows Favonius Warbow to proc. It gives it more chances to proc ultimately, so that's what's so good about it. You don't really have to invest a ton of time into Diona to make this work. And then Fischl, I mean, short of like literally getting her to Ascension 4, she doesn't have a whole lot of like investment needed, and she's pretty freaking great. So easy peasy, this team literally will shred through so many things, and it's pretty low investment all around. The next team that we're going to talk about is actually going to feature Beto, which I did talk about earlier. So the way that this team works is Eula is going to basically utilize Beto's elemental burst. It's going to give her a shield, and it's going to give her some resistance to stagger, and it's going to help do some electro damage on top of the normal damage that Eula is already doing. With that being said, if you already are using Eula and Beto, this is actually a really good team for the Lithic Blade, like we were talking about earlier, if you are going for something like this. Other option would be to run a battery. Typically, Diona is preferred here, but you could honestly go with Kaya or Rosaria as well. Diona kind of slightly outpaces both of them because she does provide decent heals for the entire team, and because her E has many chances to proc depending on which weapon you use. And last but not least, running Fischl makes a ton of sense. The elemental resonance for having both Beto and Fischl on the same team is pretty freaking good as well, generating particles for just performing electro-based reactions. And ultimately, that is going to really help with Beto also needing a ton of energy to fire off her burst. Having that damage rotation for the extra energy is super important here because you do have both Eula and Beto that cost 80 energy to fire off their bursts, and you're wanting to kind of keep both of these bursts as close to cooldown as possible. It's pretty difficult to maintain sometimes, but it pays off and it does a ton of freaking damage for you, and it's really, really good. There is also a damage rotation while you are in full swing here. When you do end up getting Beto's burst going, if you end up doing E, N1, Q, N1, E, N4, D, N2, and hold E.
Crush. Flood of frost. Rack and ruin.
That is going to be your most optimal rotation on Eula to maximize the amount of damage under that burst, because basically you don't want to end up running, you want to have as many hits as you can get while under Beto's burst ultimately. And last but not least, we should definitely talk about the current team that I have set up here, which is Eula, Zhongli, Fischl, and Rosaria. Now, the idea behind this team is that Zhongli is just a monster, and he's going to provide a ton of extra utility for your team. Not only is he going to provide a shield, but he's going to provide the resistance shred, and he's not going to have a ton of investment put into him. I know most people already have invested in him if they have him, so with a decently invested Zhongli, you're typically looking for like close to 40,000 HP on him to maximize the amount of HP that your shield can have while under Eula's rotations. You definitely would try to have somewhere around that, which isn't drastically difficult to do. Having, of course, Rosaria or Kaya here again, just as the battery character to feed Eula extra energy, and Fischl ultimately to provide superconduct and energy while off field. This is kind of like the end all be all, like just resistance shred everything and doing a ton of damage. It's also not super heavy in terms of investment, and it has a decent payoff in terms of overall damage as well. All right, guys, that's pretty much going to be all that I've got for you today. Hopefully you can take this information and either decide that you want to pull for Eula, or if you did already get Eula and you've just been kind of wondering what to do with her, hopefully this puts you in the right place. I hope that this format makes it a little bit easier to digest the information, and hopefully I can continue this for future character guides and stuff like that. I do actually, I have been thinking a lot lately about going back and fixing some of the other guides that I have. For instance, we talked a lot about Kaya today. The guide that I have on Kaya is probably one of the most popular guides that I have out there, but I messed up quite a few things, especially with just like his talents and just like the way that they scale and stuff like that. I messed up quite a few things, and I think it's probably time that I go back and fix some of those, but I don't just want to go back and just say, hey, here's this exact same place that Kaya was last time I did this video. I do actually want to start working on them. You may have noticed that my Eula was level 90. I don't know if I ever showed it, but I actually got Eula to level 90 just because I feel like from this point on, if I'm going to be building the characters, I need to build them right. And honestly, I just have been kind of worried about level 90ing anything, because once I start level 90ing stuff, I literally will have nothing left to do in this game. So I actually level 90'd Ganyu out of the poll that I had. I did that, and then I did Hu Tao as well because she's just Hu Tao, and I like my Hu Tao. And because Eula was the next character that I needed to do, and I wanted to start this new format on the right foot, I went ahead and did her as well. So anyways, hopefully you guys got some good information out of this, and yeah, that's pretty much it. See ya.